The House Committee on the Judiciary will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on securing America's elections. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Yesterday, the Director of National Intelligence testified that, quote, "The greatest challenge we have as a nation is making sure to maintain the integrity of our election system," close quote. Excuse me. I agree. Our democracy was founded on a government elected by the people, for the people, in free and fair elections. Today, our elections, the very core of our democracy, are under attack. Special Counsel Mueller's report, in no uncertain terms, detailed how a foreign government attacked our 2016 elections. The Russian objectives were clear: deepen distrust and discord in our society, secure the election of one candidate for president over the other, and in so doing, undermine confidence in the integrity of our elections and damage our nation's standing in the world. There is no evidence that Russia affected the actual vote count of our elections. But Russia did successfully steal thousands of documents from American citizens that it used to influence public opinion. It also accessed voter data and gained other valuable intelligence, which it may seek to exploit in the future. In short, as Special Counsel Mueller emphasized in his recent press conference, Russia's attack, quote, "deserves the attention of every American." Russia's attack was not an isolated incident, nor is Russia the only foreign power attempting to influence our elections. We live in a world with agile, persistent enemies who are constantly evolving their methods of attack. As FBI Director Christopher Wray warned, make no mistake, the threat just keeps escalating, and we're going to have to up our game to stay ahead of it. Despite concrete evidence confirmed by the heads of our intelligence agencies, President Trump has refused to acknowledge Russia's attack, let alone publicly denounce it, or outline clearly how he intends to deter future interventions. To the contrary, the President has openly declared that he sees no problem with foreign influence in our elections. More troubling, there have been reports from multiple senior White House officials, including the former Secretary of Homeland Security, the organization tasked with leading our election security efforts, that the White House failed to adequately inform Americans about continuing influence efforts and instead directly stymied attempts to investigate or even discuss the attacks on our elections. More troubling still, we now have evidence that the President of the United States asked a foreign leader to interfere in our next election. The President is not only refusing to defend our elections against foreign attacks, but is actively soliciting such intervention. That is unacceptable, and it puts our nation at great risk. We must not let foreign attacks go unpunished or undeterred, and we must make the investments necessary to withstand any future attacks. The Judiciary Committee is tasked with the duty of protecting the right to vote for every American. That includes not just equal voting rights and access to the polls, but also confidence in the accuracy and security of our election systems. We will protect that sacred right. We will not let anyone, not even the President, attempt to undermine the integrity of our democracy. Today's hearing will help carry out that duty. To ensure that we understand the extent and scope of the threat to our 2020 elections, and to identify appropriate steps for deterring, detecting, and defending against those threats. I am pleased that last week the Senate finally approved a bipartisan spending bill to safeguard voting systems, but much more needs to be done. U.S. elections are not built of isolated parts. The existing infrastructure is a vast ecosystem that includes voter registration, vote casting, vote tabulation, election night reporting, and auditing systems. Each of those components is vulnerable to attack. And as with any ecosystem, if any one component part fails, if there is a flaw in one piece of the technology, it can jeopardize the entire process. As former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson explained, the integrity of our election outcomes on a national level dances on the head of a pin. Securing our election system, therefore, requires securing each of its component parts. This begins with ensuring that we can verify all votes through post-election audits to certify that each vote is accurately counted, which will help maintain trust and transparency in the election process. We must also secure our voter registration databases, voting machines, and voting systems. A report published this spring found that in at least 40 states, voter registration databases and machines were instituted more than a decade ago. Outdated systems are difficult to maintain, are subject to serious flaws and vulnerabilities, and are more vulnerable to attacks from the outside. Our adversaries are agile and technologically advanced. We must be too. We must provide states with the resources needed to secure their systems and update their critical infrastructure. In addition, nearly all states and territories rely on outside vendors in some capacity. But of those states and territories, roughly 92% rely on just 3 vendors. These vendors must be regulated to ensure that all of their products meet minimum election security requirements. Finally, state and local officials responsible for administering elections, our democracy's frontline defenders, must have the resources and cybersecurity training necessary to protect our voting systems. We must also develop better tools to share cybersecurity and threat information among state and local officials and the federal government. In 2016, according to the intelligence community, state election officials were not sufficiently warned or prepared to handle an attack from a hostile nation-state actor. We must ensure that each component piece of our election system is sufficiently integrated, equipped, and ready to handle any attack from any actor going into 2020 and beyond. In short, the challenges facing our elections are serious, evolving, and multi-pronged. There are no easy answers. I know that Ranking Member Collins agrees with me that the threat to our elections is a threat to the American Republic. I thank Mr. Collins for his attention to this issue, and I am pleased to say that our staff jointly selected the witnesses here today. These witnesses will help us understand further the extent and scope of the threats we face and the vulnerabilities in our systems that must be patched. Their testimony will help guide this committee's efforts to ensure the integrity of our elections, and I thank them for appearing today. I am confident that working together, we can address the imminent threat to our elections and protect our voting systems going forward. Our democracy depends on it. The ranking member has been detained, and I will recognize him for his opening statement after he arrives. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I will now introduce today's witnesses. Deborah Plunkett is a senior fellow for the Defending Digital Democracy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and an adjunct professor of cybersecurity at the University of Maryland's Graduate School. Ms. Plunkett previously served as Deputy Director and then Director of the National Security Agency's Information Assurance Directorate. She also served as the Director on the National Security Council under both President Clinton and President George W. Bush. Ms. Plunkett received a Bachelor of Science degree from Towson University, an MBA from Johns Hopkins University, and a Master of Science in National Security Strategy from the National War College. Kathy Bukvar is the Acting Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. She also serves as the Elections Committee Co-Chair for the National Association of Secretaries of State and as the association's representative on the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council. That's a nice title. Previously, Ms. Bukvar served as Senior Advisor to the Government of Pennsylvania on election modernization, as Executive Director of Life Cycle Women Care, and as Chief Counsel for the Pennsylvania Auditor General. Ms. Bukvar also worked for many years as a poll worker and voting rights attorney. Ms. Bukvar received a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD from American University, Washington College of Law.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman.
She was my student. I yield back.
I will assume she learned well. Tom Burt is the Corporate Vice President of the Customer Security and Trust Team at Microsoft Corporation, where he works to formulate and advocate Microsoft's cybersecurity policy globally, including advancing the Digital Geneva Convention, the Tech Accord, and the Defending Democracy Project. Mr. Burt joined Microsoft in 1995 and has since held several leadership roles in the Corporate, External, and Legal Affairs Department, including leading the company's litigation group from 1996 to 2007, and more recently, leading the Digital Trust Team. Prior to joining Microsoft, Mr. Burt was a litigation partner at Riddell Williams, a law firm in Seattle, where he worked on voting rights cases. Mr. Burt received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Stanford University and a JD from the University of Washington Law School, where he graduated magna cum laude. We welcome all our distinguished witnesses, and we thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. And raise your right hands, please. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? So help you God. Thank you. Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Ms. Plunkett, you may begin.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My testimony focuses on potential security vulnerabilities of our election systems and recommendations to better protect our democratic processes and systems from cyber attacks. We must take bold, decisive, and expeditious steps to address cyber threats and then assume our efforts are insufficient given the rise of attackers' capabilities. All known threats must be addressed in order to better ensure secure and trusted elections. Bad actors, whether nation states or lone criminals, focus on gaining unauthorized access to systems that provide the best opportunity to achieve their goals, including influence, destruction, profit, espionage, coercion, or just fun and fame. Attackers can make their attempts from across an ocean or from down the street. We must treat election security as imperative for safeguarding our democracy. Intelligence leaders warn of ongoing and escalating interference attempts by multiple foreign actors who view our 2020 elections as an opportunity to advance their interests at the expense of American democracy. In the United States, elections are complex and decentralized. The United States has over 10,000 election jurisdictions. These jurisdictions vary by technology and processes. Recognizing the variety of election jurisdictions is central to developing and implementing strategies to improve election infrastructure security. While elections operations can vary significantly across jurisdictions, there are fundamental similarities in some infrastructures. Many election systems are built using general-purpose technology and commercial off-the-shelf software. While this means they are often subject to attacks popular in other sectors, it also means experts have identified some best practices to mitigate many of the risks. The key is to make sure these solutions are kept up to date. At Harvard, the Belfer Center's Defending Digital Democracy project produced a state and local election security playbook, which identifies 10 best practices that apply to all elections jurisdictions, which I'll briefly summarize today. The first is to create a proactive security culture. Most cyber compromises start with human error. A strong security culture makes a big difference as to the success of a malicious actor. The second is to treat elections as an interconnected system. Any digital device that touches election processes must be safeguarded. Device security management should be centralized and streamlined. The third is to require a paper vote record. It is essential to have a voter-verified, auditable paper record to allow votes to be cross-checked against electronic results. And the paper record must have a rigorous chain of custody. The fourth is to use audits to show transparency and maintain trust in the elections process. Auditing should be embedded at points in the process where data, integrity, and accuracy are critical. The fifth is to implement strong passwords and two-factor authentication. While strong passwords are important, two-factor authentication is one of the best defenses against account compromise. Number 6 is to control and actively manage access, where users should receive the minimum access required to perform their jobs. When someone no longer needs access, it should be revoked. Number 7 is to prioritize and isolate sensitive data and systems so that you know which systems should be properly protected. Number 8 is to monitor, log, and back up data. which enables attack detection and system or data recovery after an incident. Number 9 is to require vendors to make security a priority. Detailed security specifications should be written into acquisition documents, and vendors must be required to notify officials immediately after becoming aware of a breach. And finally, number 10 is to build public trust and prepare for information operations. Transparency and open communications will counter information operations that seek to cast doubt over the integrity of the election system. In conclusion, election systems are critical infrastructure. To protect them, the federal government must provide the requisite guidance and support by allocating resources to upgrade election systems to the highest security standards, ensuring information exchange between federal, state, and local entities is seamless, instituting security standards that vendors must follow for election systems or components, and encouraging a culture of security by keeping the American public fully informed on malicious actors' behaviors and intentions and the government's efforts to stop them. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important dialogue today.
Chairman Nadler and esteemed members of the committee, thank you so much for your leadership on election security. As Chief Election Official of Pennsylvania, I have the privilege of working with dedicated election officials across the Commonwealth in all 67 counties to make sure that all of our elections are fair, accessible, and secure for all eligible voters. As has already been discussed, the issues surrounding election administration have become more complex and complicated because of security issues. As we know, foreign adversaries are continuously trying to influence our elections. The key to thwarting this effort is to make sure that we are building our cyber walls faster than those that are trying to tear them down. Election security is a race without a finish line, and our adversaries are not slowing down. We need to make sure that we are meeting and exceeding those technologies and making sure that we invest at all levels substantial and sustained resources. Alongside the great majority of states, we urge the federal government to provide additional election security funding, but also infrastructure. And we need to look at this like we look at other ongoing initiatives. So we don't do once and done appropriations for other types of security, for healthcare, for education. We look at these as ongoing investments, and that's how we have to look at our elections. Nothing is more important than the security of our democracy. There have been great advances over the last many years. As discussed, the EIS-GCC, the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council, say that 5 times fast, has been a great collaboration among federal, state, and local officials to secure elections, and it's working to formalize and improve information sharing, communication protocols, to make sure that our local and state election officials can respond to timely to threats. The great thing about EIS-GCC is that it has a wide range of members. So we've got 29 members, 24 of them are local and state election officials, but it also includes critical federal partners like DHS, EAC, NASA, the Election Center, and the International Association of Government Officials. Other key partners in this fight are DHS, National Guard, Center for Internet Security, who have been incredibly strong partners, making sure that we have risk and vulnerability assessments, shared intelligence, tabletop exercise, and extensive communications. But there's more that we could do. So one of the things that I'd love to see the federal government being more involved in is vendor oversight, tracking foreign ownership, making sure that we're getting background checks, making sure that there's a good chain of custody across all voting and elections components. We also need to strengthen lines of communication in both directions, from federal, state, and local. For example, when there are local incidents reported to our federal partners, the federal partners need to make sure that the state election officials know so that we could timely respond to those incidents. On the Pennsylvania landscape, we've had some great successes over the last year and a half that I've been very proud to be a part of. We've really had we broke down silos. We knew it was really important to have an integrated approach to election security, and it's been incredibly effective. We have an interagency work group that involves IT professionals, security, law enforcement, homeland security, elections, and emergency preparedness. We meet regularly and work together to make sure that we are working together as a front to make sure we have the most secure and accessible elections in Pennsylvania. We've provided tabletop exercises, and we were the first state in the country to accept DHS's offer of free vulnerability assessments to states. One of our big successes over the last year has been our transition in Pennsylvania to voter-verified paper ballot systems. I'm happy to say that whereas a year ago we had 50 counties across Pennsylvania that had no paper trails, as of this November there will be 52 counties that will have voter-verifiable paper trails. So a huge flip, great success, and a credit to the county election officials for all their work. I'm also happy to say that we have a post-election audit work group. As discussed by Chairman, this is a critical piece of our elections, is making sure that we're auditing and instilling confidence in our voters about confirming the results of the election. The right to vote is a fundamental right, and every voter must be provided equal access to the polls and a deep-seated confidence in the security and accuracy of their votes. Our democracy and bolstering our confidence in that democracy is worth every dollar. Thank you very much.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important topic of how emerging technology can contribute to the security of our elections. My name is Tom Burt. I'm the Corporate Vice President for Customer Security and Trust at Microsoft. My team includes our Defending Democracy program, which works to protect democratic elections from cyber attack around the world. We know that skilled and well-financed adversaries have and certainly will continue to attack elections in the U.S. and in other countries, all in the pursuit of their goal of undermining citizen confidence in democracy. Defending democracy and our elections are important to Microsoft, so we spent the last year working on what we as a technology provider can contribute to this effort. And I'm pleased to inform the committee that this week we released free open source software development kit called Election Guard. Simply put, Election Guard technology can enable the most secure and trustworthy elections in the history of the United States. How does it do this? When a vote is cast, it is immediately encrypted so that it can't be seen or changed. The voter then receives a tracking number, and when the election is complete, the voter can go online and check to see for the first time in history that their vote was in fact counted and unchanged. Election Guard, more than that, also enables anyone, voting officials, the media, third-party watchdog organizations, to build a verifier application that will let them confirm that the tally is correct and unchanged. All of this can be done without ever decrypting individual votes, through the use of homomorphic encryption, a well-established technology that can count votes without ever decrypting the underlying data. Election Guard is designed to work with many of the voting systems in use today, including electronic ballot marking devices or hand-marked paper ballots read by optical scanners, and we have on our roadmap making it work with other forms of elections. We've made this technology free and open to everyone. Microsoft is not making any revenue from Election Guard. We've been working closely with all the major US election vendors, encouraging them to build systems with Election Guard, and we're excited to report that their response has been uniformly enthusiastic. But there is a significant impediment to the rapid adoption of this and other new voting technologies: the complex and outdated federal election machine certification process. This process is more than a decade old, and it's too slow and too burdensome to enable voting officials to respond as quickly as needed to our agile adversaries. Unfortunately, this means that new machines using Election Guard likely will not be certified in time for use in the 2020 national election. This certification process also hinders basic security hygiene. Today, if a voting machine is updated with a minor security patch from a trusted vendor, it will have to go through a full recertification process. This creates a significant disincentive for election officials and vendors to deploy security patches, leaving our elections vulnerable. We're pleased that the Election Assistance Commission is in the process right now of revising these certification rules, and we would ask all of you to encourage the Commission to adopt soon new rules that enable rapid and agile deployment of new security technology and basic security hygiene. While we and others in the private sector can contribute technological advances to secure the vote, there is of course an important role for Congress. We agree with Ms. Plunkett's written testimony regarding the urgent need for long-term sustainable funding. This is critically needed to enable election officials to plan ahead, to purchase new equipment rather than letting outdated systems remain active, and to invest in cybersecurity training and staffing that we expect of all critical infrastructure providers. We live in a world with agile enemies who are persistent in their efforts to interfere in our democratic process. Our citizens deserve to be able to cast their vote with confidence that it will be counted without manipulation. We believe Election Guard is breakthrough technology that can help achieve this goal. But we remain committed to working with government, civil society, the technology sector to take even more steps to ensure that every vote is counted and every voter has confidence in our free and fair elections. The stewardship of our democracy requires nothing less. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to focus initially on one component of our election systems that I find particularly concerning: voter registration databases. The Mueller report concluded that on approximately June 2016, the Russian intelligence organization, GRU, compromised the computer network of the Illinois State Board of Elections and gained access to a database concerning information on millions of registered Illinois voters, unquote. Ms. Plunkett, in this case, the Russian hackers successfully breached the databases, but they failed to alter or to delete voting records. My question to you is, if Russian hackers had changed voting records, including deleting voters from the databases, can you describe the specific possible impacts they could have had on the election? If they had altered the databases?
Well, I mean, it would have been devastating had they altered the databases, and altering in this case could have been changing records, it could have been deleting records, which would have made it, in some cases, impossible for voters to vote, to register to vote. Voters could have been turned away. They could have inserted voters erroneously into the database that could have provided an opportunity for those who shouldn't be voting to vote. So it would have been devastating had that happened.
So thousands or tens of thousands of voters might have turned up at the polls and been turned away because there was no record of their registration.
That's correct.
Thousands of non-existent voters might have voted.
That's correct.
Thank you. Ms. Plunkett, the House-passed appropriations bill contains $600 million in funding for states. It also includes accountability measures. It requires that funding cannot be used to purchase non-qualified voting machines. The Senate's version has only $250 million with no accountability restrictions. Your written testimony emphasizes the need to replace paperless machines and implement robust post-election audits using paper ballots. Now, we saw in 2000 how one county's failure to properly maintain its chads or non-chads held up the entire country. And one county's dereliction could again conceivably hold up the entire country's election, national election. Now, I understand why some states or counties might not want to spend the money necessary to update their election machinery so they can't be hacked. But I was astounded to read recently, a couple of days ago in fact, that states are still spending large amounts of money on voting machines that are electronic, that do not have paper trails, that are unauditable and vulnerable to hacking. So my question is, aside from the obvious necessity of appropriating money to update our election machinery so that we have hack-proof machines that cannot be tampered with from the outside and that leave auditable trails, which means paper trails. Do you think that that the federal government should mandate this? Because after all, the federal elections are premised on accurate counts in every state and county? Should we mandate, as well as providing the funds for modern election technology so that we can be sure that no foreign actor is, in fact, hacking, phonying up our vote, and perhaps even doing so and leaving no trail that you knew it later?
So woe is me to make a comment about federal and state roles and responsibilities, but here's what I'd say, sir. It is incumbent upon every state to institute the appropriate security measures and make sure that their technology is the most robust available in order to protect the democracy in their election and votes. And I believe that there's a role for the federal government in this space that starts with requiring that vendors follow a certain security standards in the production and delivery and maintenance of the equipment that these states are using. So that would thereby standardize at least the security of those systems, everything from auditing and database management to on the back end, should something happen to the systems, being able to report on that.
Obviously, if the federal government mandated that only proper machines could be made, then new purchases would only be of proper machines. In the 5 seconds I've got left, do any of the other witnesses want to comment on whether they think it necessary for the federal government to mandate that existing machines be replaced in time for the next election so that we can guarantee an election undictated from Moscow or someplace else?
We think as the Election Assistance Commission is revising its standards for certification, there's an opportunity there to inject standards for the security of the devices to be certified. And I would caution, though, that we must be careful not to specify specific technological solutions, right, because our enemies move very quickly. We need to be agile in response. But to have basic security guidelines that are part of that certification process would be an advance in the current state and would help us secure our elections.
Thank you. Ms. Bookvar, quickly, because my time has expired.
Chairman, I just want to say that I think you've mentioned a lot of the areas that we need to invest. You talked about voter registration systems. You talked about, I think you talked about sensors, intrusion detection sensors, and all kinds of other things. So what I'd like to see is that we define a continuum, a number of different things that are critical priorities, but allow the states who know best what's the most critical need in their state to decide what the best use of those funds are.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Byrd, I'm interested in the election guard technology that you were talking about earlier. And one of the interests I have is that the United States wasn't the only country that Russia targeted in the last decade. It's clear that Russia tried to impugn the integrity of the Brexit vote, the Scottish independence vote. They've been involved in Spain with the Catalonia independence movement. Will Microsoft make Election Guard available to our allies, foreign countries, or something similar so that we can try to make sure that democracies across the world have elections that are considered by their people to have integrity?
Yes, that's absolutely our plan, Congressman. As you may know, our account guard service, which we offer for free to help protect campaigns against being hacked, we've extended that now to 26 countries around the world, and we intend to do the same with Election Guard technology as well. It is a free open source project, so any vendor in any country is free to take that technology and build it into election systems. We work to expand our protections to all democracies committed to free and fair elections.
Okay. And Mr. Byrd, one of the things I'm interested in is exactly, you've used the word agile a number of times, and I'm assuming that there is a distinction between hardware and software when you're talking about agility, and I'm wondering if you could just explain that. When the chairman talks about, and rightfully, updating systems. I think we're in large part talking about hardware. I want to make sure that we have hardware that's compatible with whatever the software is that we need to be agile with.
Yes, it's absolutely important that both hardware and software be the most secure current engineering, and there's work to do, frankly, on both sides of that. But most importantly, for most of these systems, it's the ability to update software. As I mentioned in my written testimony, we just announced recently that we are going to provide free security updates to Windows 7 election voting devices because we discovered that there are many of those devices still in operation around the country, even though that's decades-old technology. And it reaches its end of life this January for most customers. But because of the importance of securing our vote, we are providing for free those security updates through the end of 2020. The challenge, though, is, as I mentioned earlier, with current regulations, it's actually very difficult and burdensome for local officials to even apply security patches to their devices. So we need to work on both the software and hardware side of the equation to ensure that we can be agile in adopting the best technology to defend against these attacks.
So for old folks like me, we think that if it's not on paper, it's not secure and it's not believable. And I just want to open this up for the young folks on the panel here. If you have an opinion on how we convince the American public, because that's really the audience in this case, is making sure the American public understands we're doing everything we can to make elections credible. How do we convince the American public that something that we can't see, that exists out there somewhere, is just as good as a paper ballot and being able to see something on paper?
If I could start off, and at least I'll claim to be young at heart, Congressman, there are two really important things we can do to help establish that trust. And one which you've heard about from others, which we absolutely endorse at Microsoft, is the existence of a paper backup, at least, that can be used in risk-limiting audits. And in fact, our election guard technology supports an advanced form of risk-limiting audits, which enables voting officials to audit the outcome after the vote and show that it wasn't tampered with. So that's one important thing, is the application of audits and the maintenance of at least a paper backup so that you always have that as a resource to go to. But again, if we can get to a world where the election guard technology is broadly adopted, that provides a whole new form of voter trust, because now voters will be able to, for the very first time, actually see that their vote got counted and wasn't changed. Today, I'm from Washington State. I have no idea whether the ballot I marked was ever actually counted or not. With this technology, voters will know, which should help establish voter trust.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I don't often do this, but I wanted to thank you for holding this hearing. I think this is beneficial. I think it has very little to do with partisanship. I think it's important for everybody on both sides of the aisle and all around the country to make sure we have this integrity. So thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me add my appreciation for this very crucial hearing as well. Thank you to all of the witnesses. Let me ask one question from each of you with a yes or no answer. Do you think it is important for there to be governmental involvement in a regulatory structure, in review of the technologies as we move toward the upcoming elections as quickly as possible? Ms. Plunkett? Yes. Secretary Brockner?
Bookvar, yes.
And Mr. Burt?
Yes, I do.
Let me ask Ms. Plunkett with respect to the 2016 election and the Russian GRU officers compromised the computer network of the Illinois State Board of Elections and gained access to a database containing information on millions of registered Illinois voters. The Russian GRU officers were able to steal data of thousands of U.S. voters before Illinois was aware of the hack. If Russia had succeeded in all these efforts, can you explain how attacking voter registration software and electronic polling stations can impact an election?
Certainly, since the foundation of the voter system begins with the registration databases, which validates that a voter is eligible to cast a vote. Should that database be altered in any way, whether it be destroyed or deleted or additions made to it, it could jeopardize the ability of a legitimate citizen who has the right to vote from voting, and would certainly alter the outcome of the election because it would prevent those who should be able to vote from casting their votes.
In essence, it would undermine the very basis of our democracy.
That's correct.
Mr. Burt, you've mentioned the election guard. We're all fascinated by that. It's outstanding technology. But in your marketing to the entire world, I'm not sure what kind of litmus test you're going to use to determine whether or not it is a democratic government, and what is the potential of innocent democratic governments now giving technology of that level of sophistication to be utilized then to hack into the system. What are the protections and the firewalls on your system if by chance you sell it to an enemy, a foreign enemy?
Congresswoman, we're actually being quite deliberate and careful about the countries to which we expand our services, but let me be clear about Election Guard. It's an open source project that anyone can access, and that actually leads to the security, because as people find any flaws or security flaws in the software, it can be updated. What's important to understand is that this technology is not capable of being used as an offensive weapon. What it does is secure the vote. What it does is ensure that votes are encrypted and can't be changed or altered, and it ensures that the vote can be verified and that the count can be properly verified by individual voters and by any third party. So to the extent that this technology is deployed even in countries that we would not consider an ally, it just means that their votes are going to be more trustworthy
So it
than they
doesn't
are
give them the
today.
ability to breach or to hack into the votes of another country?
That's correct.
Let me ask the Secretary and Bookvar, what is the importance of having a variety of technologies that states can have access to than the limited number of vendors that we already have in terms of protecting the election process?
So I think one of the benefits that we have, decentralized systems have their advantages and disadvantages, but having the variety of technology is definitely an advantage, because the likelihood of the ability to breach all the different technologies is certainly harder than if you had one uniform across the board. So it's key to keep the diversity of our system.
And you only have, I think someone mentioned 3, and so having us be able to certify or legislation that deals with expanding that opportunity would also enhance the security and safety of elections. Let me, you're all lawyers, and in the past election 2016, we've determined that there were a lot of foreign operatives. Do you think it's important to have legislation that indicates that if you, an elected official or a candidate, are approached by a foreign adversary, that you need to report that immediately to an organization, agency such as the FBI? Ms. Plunkett? I'm just asking everybody across the board.
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do
Secretary?
as well, Congressman.
Ms. Burt?
Certainly.
I ask unanimous consent to place into the record H.R. 2353.
Without objection.
Can an effective deceptive campaign spoofing attack be deployed through user search engine request? I'll repeat it. Can an effective deceptive campaign spoofing attacks be deployed through user search engine request? Can you just answer the question, Mr. Burt?
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The witnesses may answer the question.
Yes, that's possible, although a more fulsome answer would take a considerable period of time in terms of how that would work and how we can defend against it.
The time,
I agree, yes.
All right. Thank you. I yield my time.
gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with the comments of the gentlelady from Texas and the gentleman from Colorado that election security issues must be viewed as a bipartisan endeavor for us to be able to make progress, and that all voters deserve to have confidence in that process. I must say it was a little disheartening that the chairman began the hearing by taking a bunch of partisan shots at the president. I don't understand how that is helpful to the work that we're doing here. And really, thinking in terms of the value of elections most broadly, I fear that the greatest risk to our democracy may not be hacks or interference with the vote. It may be the efforts by radical Democrats to try to impeach a president who was duly elected. That seems to undo elections a lot more than hacking. But alas, back to this important work of the committee. I wanted to thank Congresswoman Murphy as the lead, but also our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Deutsch and Ms. McChrystal-Powell from Florida, for co-authoring H.R. 3529. And this bipartisan legislation requires the head of the Department of Homeland Security to notify state and local election officials in the event of some intrusion or hack. And so my question is really to any of the members of the panel to speak to the utility and importance of real-time coordination in the event of an intrusion, and how you might see state and local officials working cooperatively and proactively with the federal government in such an endeavor.
I'd love to take a crack at that. Thank you, Congressman. It's critically important that collaboration at the state, local, and federal level. And we saw it in Pennsylvania last year, in November of 2018's election. We were connected across the country to other states and to the federal government, getting real-time information about things that were being seen in other states. And we could not only take, so for example, there were attempts to hack into, to send DDoS types of interruptions in other states. IP addresses were identified, passed along to other states. We then, in turn, were connected across the state to the 67 counties, could pass along those IP addresses so they could block it proactively before having to happen. So that it was literally in action collaboration that protected our elections. So that kind of thing, both before, during, and after, is critical in order to make sure that we have the most secure elections possible.
Congressman, if I may, in 2018, under the direction of Director Krebs from CISA, there was a war room established at the federal level to which technology providers, state and local officials were all invited. We participated in that, and that was a good step forward. But what you suggest is absolutely critical. I agree that the more efficient we can have communication between all federal agencies who are aware of attacks in real time with state and local officials and also leading technology providers who stand ready to assist with this effort of protecting our elections, the better it can be. So we need to improve and expand on that rapid real-time sharing of threat information at the time of the election and before then.
I agree with both, and I just also add it's critically important, and I think a good role for the government to create the environment where information sharing can happen without restrictions, in a smooth and precise and expeditious manner, such that everyone who needs the information can get it and it's presented in a usable fashion. And I would not limit that to state and local and federal, as has already been stated. Vendors, they're very good threat intelligence organizations that are doing a great job in uncovering good information that needs to be a part of this dialogue.
That is incredibly helpful advice, especially when I think about the experiences in Florida where hackers masquerade as the vendors. So they would seem to be an important part of that community, and that's very helpful. I would also observe that there seems to be some confusion in Florida as to the extent to which any hack could lead to voter manipulation in future elections, not based on changing the tallies of the votes, but by potentially manipulating someone's name. I'm Matthew Lewis Gates II, but if someone went and changed my name to just Matt Gates on the voter rolls, potentially I would have a hard time having my vote counted. And so this may be a broader question than you're able to answer, but I am interested, and I think the Judiciary Committee could perhaps partner with others on the utility of blockchain technology to enhance the security of elections, because in an immutable, decentralized ledger, I would think that such a manipulation of the voter rolls themselves would be less likely. I would seek any comment anyone would have. I appreciate the chair's indulgence.
I think there is certainly the opportunity for blockchain to be relevant in this space. But if we think now about the American public and their understanding of voting and voting systems, We are talking about paper ballots as a backup, and generally people understand that. Blockchain technology is very complicated and is untested. I know it's being tested in West Virginia, as I understand it. So I think there's a possibility, but it's not something that I think is ready for use for a general or primary election.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the witnesses for your appearance today and for your testimony. Ms. Plunkett, the Center for American Progress recently reported that, quote, voting on paper is the most hack-proof way of conducting elections, and you agree with that, do you not?
Today, yes, I do.
And what about you, Ms. Bukvar?
Absolutely. At least with a paper record, I should say.
And Mr. Burt?
Well, I would say that we actually believe that Election Guard provides an even more hack-proof way of voting, but paper as at least a backup or as primary, because the technology would support either, is important to maintaining the security of our elections.
So when we talk about a paper ballot, we're talking about a hand-marked paper ballot. Is that right, Ms. Plunkett?
It does not necessarily have to be hand-marked, but there should be a piece of paper involved that can then be...
If the paper involved is produced by a touchscreen voting machine, and that piece of paper also has a barcode, along with the races that the voter voted on, and this paper that the machine produces with the barcode is given to the voter, who can then check it, make sure that it reflects accurately what choices were made by that voter, and then that piece of paper is then scanned into a counting machine, which counts not the actual choices made by the voter, but the barcode on top. That's the kind of paper ballot that you're talking about?
So I don't know about the barcode piece.
So I think I can answer that. So for example, and that's where audits come in, right? So for example, we're developing a process in Pennsylvania where...
I guess the question that I'm asking, if it's the barcode that is counted and not the box that is identified as the one that was checked by the voter, how does the voter know that the barcode, which is counted, actually reflects the choices that the voter made? Or does the voter just simply have to depend on the barcode to accurately reflect? How can we get around that if we're counting the barcode and not counting the hand-marked paper ballot?
So most systems, whether they're hand-marked paper ballot or ballot marking devices, use some form of mark for the tabulation process, whether it's a barcode, a QR code, or timing marks, which some of the hand-marked paper ballots use. So there's basically triggers into the tabular, and then the audit...
But then you're able to actually count the hand-marked ballot by hand.
Exactly. That's what the audit or a recount would do, would look at the plain text language on the, and it can compare. Did the tabulation numbers compare? Yes, with the hand.
The hand-marked ballot is the way that produces an auditable trail, but the ballot that is counted by the barcode and is not hand-filled out is just simply a further extension of the mechanics of the computerized voting.
If I may, Congressman, so in the context we are talking about the barcode, that paper still shows the specific individual votes, which the voter in a well-run system has had an opportunity to verify the check marks in the boxes.
Yeah, but
and so now you've got
marks are not the ones that are counted.
I understand. What I'm saying
Actually,
is,
the barcode.
even if it's not hand-marked, if it's marked by the machine, but the voter has verified those boxes, now you have a paper ballot that's verified that can be used for counting.
How does the voter verify the barcode or the counting mechanism
That's
accurately reflects the choices that the voter made.
Yeah, so that is part of the audit process that can be performed by looking at the tally against the audited subset of ballots that's selected for the audit, looking not at the barcode in this case, but looking at the boxes that are checked. So the audit system provides for that.
Let me just say this then. Isn't it clear that a hand-marked paper ballot that is then fed into a counting machine, which counts that tally along with the other voters, and then at the end of the voting process, if there is a recount, then you can actually count the paper ballot, the hand-marked paper ballot by hand, and compare that to the tally that was produced by the counting machine. Doesn't that provide the most effective way of auditing the results of an election?
I would say that it's not important whether the ballot was hand-marked or marked by a machine, as long as the voter gets the opportunity to verify that what they see on the ballot is what they intended before they deposit it in the ballot box. Either way, whether it's my hand marking or the machine that checks the box, you have a clear representation of the voter intent. And in fact, in a machine-checked box, sometimes that's clearer. As you know, with hand-marked ballots, there's often disputes about what a voter actually intended with the marking, depending on the system.
But there's no way
Gentleman's
of
time
doing
has
that.
expired.
No way of doing that with the electronic
Gentleman
voting
from-
process. And I thank the gentlelady, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, this time has expired. The gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I have time, I'm gonna come back to this, but Mr. Burton, your written testimony, you talked about future threats, and one of those was deep fakes and synthetic media being a future threat. I'm an old state party chairman. I understand how in the last 10 days of a close election, things escalate extremely quickly. Why is this such a threat, and what can we do to deal with it on the front end? I mean, I've seen I think our colleagues, they did one yesterday, and I don't know another word to say other than creepy, and they look absolutely legitimate, so.
Well, Congressman, that's exactly why it's such a threat. We know that our adversaries, among other things, engage in disinformation campaigns in which they attempt to take the extreme positions on social issues relevant to the campaign, and they try to incite conflict among the American electorate. They seek to discredit candidates or positions through their disinformation campaigns, and we should anticipate that they are going to become more sophisticated in their efforts. Synthetic media, or deep fakes as it's called regularly, the technology that enables that, both in terms of audio and video, is advancing rapidly. And as you point out, it's now possible with the most advanced technology to really create videos that appear to be entirely realistic. There's a lot of research that's going into detection technology, how to detect these deepfake videos and show that they are artificial and not real. But at the end of the day, the technology to create the videos, because of the way the artificial intelligence works, will always be ahead of any detection algorithm. So the opportunity for our adversaries to use this technology to try to influence a campaign or an election is very real. And today, as it stands right now, we don't have a great answer to that other than to educate the American public that it's going to be even more important now than it's been in the past that they consume the information that they use to make election decisions from sources they believe are credible. And there are a number of services out that try to rank and rate various sources to determine, is this a journalistically credible source or not? But in today's world, that's going to become even more important.
Thank you, and I get criticized for a lot of things I say, so I'd prefer that I not get criticized by things people make up that I say. But moving into that, I mean, as far as a defense to that as we're going forward is probably, I mean, if the technology is advancing faster than the detection of it, it probably behooves us as a body and whoever else is doing some of these things to figure out a way, particularly with platforms and things, to be able to have immediate removal and those types of efforts. Would that probably be, I mean, just as we're moving forward and going towards this, there has to be a way. I mean, we have to have a way as a Congress or as a government or just as an election to be able to deal with these things.
Yes, in the short term, I think using available detection technologies, working with the social media platforms and others to try to identify those that originate from adversaries, which is, cybersecurity technology we can deploy. Those are going to be the best things we can do for this election cycle. We and others are investing in a number of different efforts to try to come up with better ways both to detect and to identify legitimate sources of video and audio so that over time we will have a better approach to solving this challenge. But it is going to be a real challenge for us in the 2020 elections.
Then going back to the encryption stuff, and how does the broader election or encryption debate potentially affect encryption and election guard? I mean, if a government has a backdoor access, it's a backdoor that, potentially could be exploited. And that could create a built-in, weakness in the balance. How do we balance law enforcement and the ability to do that with cybersecurity?
So this is a broader question that goes beyond the election context. In the election context, the encryption that we build into Election Guard would never have a backdoor. There would be no purpose to have the backdoor, and it actually would reveal voter-specific votes, which you don't want to do for a variety of reasons. In the more broader context, this is a very nuanced discussion. There was a recent paper from the Carnegie Institute that I thought was very well done in talking about the broad range of issues relevant to encryption, law enforcement access, protection of dissidents, for example, the legitimate uses for encryption, why that's important. And one of the things that paper said, which we absolutely endorse, it's important to get very specific about the problem you're trying to address and look at that problem and how to properly balance all the competing interests as to that problem. There is no general approach to encryption that doesn't create way too many problems. So we need to be very specific, look at those specific things, and then balance the social issues to find the right result. And that's going to be some work that we all have to do, the technology industry together with government.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for this very useful and important testimony. One of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is the regulation of vendors. As you are aware, a large percentage, I think it's 97% of states and territories use vendors in some capacity, from the computers they use to access information to the servers that house information, the management of databases that contain information to cast and tally votes, websites and software used to display information and results, to the software that creates ballot design or helps transfer information across systems. And 3 vendors in particular control over 90% of this process. Of those 3, over 60% of American voters cast ballots on systems owned and operated by a single vendor. And despite the incredible impact of vendors on our electoral system, there seems to be very little regulation over vendors that really ensures election security. And as a result of it, I think we've seen some very serious issues with vendor security. So my first question really is, for each of the witnesses, is should we consider regulations at the federal level in creating some standards for vendors? And if so, why? If not, why not?
I absolutely agree that, believe that we should. Because elections and election systems are a national security threat, and for national security threats, that has been the approach of the U.S. government. It is to develop federal standards, and in this case, it would be federal security standards for election equipment that really run the gamut from how the environment in which the software is developed and ensuring that it's developed in a secure manner and appropriately protected, straight through to the implementation and maintenance, and then the responsibility for reporting any vulnerabilities that are discovered even after that software and hardware is deployed. I think it is absolutely should be done, and I believe it's a role for the federal government.
I agree on every level. And, we have the Election Assistance Commission, which does certification, but as you probably know, not only has EAC been underfunded, but they also were unable to update their standards, the voluntary VVSG standards, for a long time and didn't have a quorum. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, we stepped in, and last year when we knew we had to certify a whole bunch more voting systems, we actually created our own more stringent security standards because we didn't want to rely on the outdated ones. So it would be much more effective if the federal government were having stronger oversight, both to standards and then to oversight of, for example, we talked earlier about the foreign ownership, background checks, and making sure that there's chain of custody controls over every component of the voting and election system.
And to make those standards requirements, not voluntary.
Correct.
And Congressman, if I may add, I think we're all in agreement on that, with the one caveat that it's important that the standards not dictate any particular technology or technological solution, because that then sticks the states and local governments with a particular solution. If that becomes vulnerable, then it would take too much time to change. So they need to be generalized standards so that there can be innovation in terms of the technology approach that's used to meet those standards.
That makes sense. In addition to the establishment of mandatory standards, are there other things Congress should be thinking about with respect to the role vendors play in our electoral process and the integrity of our elections?
One thing that is another one of the future threats that I think the vendors can be playing a more significant role is the risk of ransomware and ransomware attack, especially on the voter registration rolls. This is something that Director Krebs from CISA pointed out a few weeks ago after this whole rash of ransomware attacks we've seen on small municipalities around the country, 10 in Texas alone relatively recently. The risk that our adversaries will use that same malware injected into the voter registration devices, and basically you'll show up on the day of the election and the entire database will be locked up and you can't see it. That's a significant risk. So vendors need to work with their customers to help them understand how to establish defenses, how to have and build into the system backups that are offline backups, and do tabletop exercises so that state and local officials know how to restore those systems very rapidly so there's no interruption in the voting process in the event that everything else that we do to try to maintain security is unsuccessful.
Thank you. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this really important hearing. There's nothing more fundamental than protecting the right of the American people to have their voices heard and their votes counted in our elections. And this requires strong leadership from everyone at every level of government. And I really thank you for conducting this hearing.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate y'all being here. I noted that the chairman said basically that he was astounded to find counties still buying machines with no paper trail. Ms. Plunkett, were you at the NSA back in 2000, 2001?
Yes, I was.
Do you remember who mandated that every county or parish in America buy electronic voting machines and there was no requirement for paper trails because that was more expensive? Do you remember who mandated that?
No, I do not.
Well, I was working for the state and county as a judge, and counties were outraged that they had an unfunded mandate by this Congress that some people here were in. Democrats intimidated Republicans because of the votes in Florida. Even though there were fifth graders tested, none of them had trouble with the butterfly ballots and such. Apparently people that were trying to vote Democrat had a lot of trouble with them. So there was outrage, there was demand for electronic voting, and the federal government, Congress mandated it. And it was very, very difficult for counties, many counties, to come out of the financial burden that this Congress put on them. And so if some of them have had trouble recovering financially for the poor finally got mad and went and bought an Apple. It was a Mac. It was the best thing I ever did, bought dozens since. But when I was in Congress, I wanted a Mac, and I got one, but Microsoft systems is what things are based on here. It screwed up my computer, and they said, look, you just can't have a Mac if you're going to communicate with other computers around it. So I just didn't know. And I understand that your job is security and trust with Microsoft, so maybe they hadn't told you, but is there any backdoor into Election Guard that Microsoft might have in order to fix or deal with some problem in the system?
Absolutely not, Congressman. There is no...
As far as you know.
Well, not only as far as I know, but it was my team that did the engineering work on this Election Guard. Okay. And so I am confident there is no backdoor. The other thing I would say again is we are making it an open source project. So the source code is available today on GitHub for anybody to look at. And we actually encourage hackers to try to hack into it so that we can find any security flaws and fix them.
And one of the problems, since really we're all very concerned about election security, no matter how good your system is, it can't do anything about a county that hires a vendor, as my colleague was just bringing up, and the vendor at the end of our early voting on Friday before the election on Tuesday takes the 48 flash drives from the 48 precincts home and plays with them until Election Day. Your system can't help with that kind of problem, correct?
Actually, Congressman, the Election Guard technology, the way it works, actually provides security and trustworthiness even if you have a vendor or an election official who's been compromised or has some malign intent, because the vote gets encrypted the moment that the voter votes on it, and it's never decrypted after that.
Yeah.
So it's protected against any of those kinds of attacks.
But
and then
if it's protected against that kind of abuse, then a county may not want to use your system if they need a vendor to take them home and play with them. But I'm concerned that each of you think it is possible to rig an American election. And if that's the case, I just warn you that in President Obama's eyes, that would make you a non-serious person, because he said no serious person out there would suggest somehow you could even rig America's elections. And I would encourage you, since traditionally dead people vote nearly 100% Democrat, that you figure out a way to secure our graveyards so people don't keep turning out and voting in our elections. My time's expired.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. It's really, I think, very important, the information that you're giving to us. As I've come to learn more about this issue, I've been quite stunned that the United States is currently the only major democracy without a centralized agency governing cybersecurity. And although we have multiple federal agencies that have some role to play in protecting elections, there's no clear place that a local county that's concerned about hacking can go to. I read this recent UK report that explains that there are single centralized cybersecurity agencies that coordinate national security in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, but the same report notes that in the United States, international cybersecurity efforts must go through multiple US agencies, including the NSA, DHS, and the FBI. And so I'm really interested in this idea of centralized and cohesive coordination of our nation's cybersecurity to better protect from foreign and domestic threats. Mr. Burt, I want to thank you for your work and say how proud I am that Washington State is Microsoft's home state and that I have the honor of representing many, many, many Microsoft workers as my constituents. And I think you have brought up some really, you've done some really important work with the Election Guard technology. I'm curious, I know you just released it. Is it actually in use anywhere yet? Are we using it in Washington, I guess, is the most relevant question.
No, it's not yet in use anywhere because, as you say, just released it for public use just in the last few days. We are working with all the major election, working with all the election vendors They're all very enthusiastic. They're in the process now of evaluating the technology and thinking about how they could build it into new offerings, new devices. And so we need both the election vendors as well as state and local officials to understand the technology, think about how they can use it to secure their election. And we're out, actively helping explain and educate that. We do expect that either later this year or certainly in 2020, we're working with a number of partners on some at least pilot elections where it will be used for a certain precinct or in a certain location so that we can actually test the technology, make sure that it's working as expected hopefully in the coming months and certainly by 2020.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering, is perhaps if we were pilot testing it in Washington. In your testimony, you talked about imposing a culture of cybersecurity, including training, and I was also struck by the fact that many of the existing voting systems were using Windows 7. In your testimony you talked about, or in your written statement you talked about that. How do we, and maybe this is a question for you, but also for you, Ms. Boockvar, how do we make sure that we are providing the support and incentivizing in some way states and local counties to update their technology? Because we can have the best stuff and we can put it out there, but if people don't continue to update, we're going to have this problem. But do either of you have comments on that?
Well, I think you've heard a number of comments that address that already today from the testimony. I would say we basically endorse the comments from both of the other witnesses, which is, among other things, a set of consistent federal standards on security for elections would be useful guidance. But you also need to have a sustained, durable, long-term funding solution so that state and local agencies are not stuck because of financial considerations with outdated technology. This is just too important to our democracy. We need to make sure that we have the most secure systems possible in every state and local election.
Is it just about money, though, or is it also about people's fear of how to use technology, not perhaps having their technology officers in place? Either of you, please.
There's a role really for lots of different pieces of the puzzle here. So from everything from, sorry about that. We were talking earlier about how it would have been great if the new systems, for example, in Pennsylvania that we just certified over the last year, it would have been great if they were never made with Windows 7 so that there was an earlier sort of prevention measure in place that just involves regulation at the front end. But then, I think at the county level and at the state level and at the federal level to have easier certification. So when there is the transition and the upgrade of technology, we need to be able to make sure that those systems can be in use without being out of play for a while. So there's a lot of different levels of it.
You mean made with Windows 7 as this, because things have an operating system within them, but what do you mean by that?
So that's their operating system base. So for example, it would have been great if all of the systems that were even being made over the last year were already Windows 10. Some were, some weren't.
I see, that they were updated as they were being put out.
Correct. And the counties, there were negotiations, in terms of the money piece, there were negotiations with the vendors to make sure that they weren't going to charge for the upgrade, but it would have been better if there was never a need for upgrade because they had been made with Windows 10 to begin with.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm grateful to you for holding this hearing today. It's an issue that has been in need of examination for some time, and I'm hopeful that after today's hearing we'll be able to act on some of the excellent ideas that have been discussed this morning and many others that have been put forward by members on this committee. While the responsibility of carrying out elections is one mainly for local and state governments, the federal government does have a critical role to play, as has been discussed. It's a fact that other countries are trying to interfere in U.S. elections, Russia most notably, and we must remain vigilant to ensure that foreign adversaries cannot meddle in our electoral process. New threats will never cease, and our nation must stay on the cutting edge to ensure our elections remain secure. Our laws guarantee the American people just and fair elections, and it's our duty to carry out that mandate and resist all forms of tyranny that threaten our freedom. I have listened with interest. It seems like we're moving in two different directions, one toward less technology, paper ballots, one toward more use of technology, decentralization, blockchain, I'm curious about real-time testing of blockchain in West Virginia. Ms. Bookvar, your neighboring state, West Virginia, had apparent success in the midterms in using blockchain to allow deployed overseas service members to vote. Have you explored any similar initiatives in Pennsylvania, and what have you done to ensure that overseas deployed service members can vote?
So we have not explored directly. We are, I think, across the country, we're very closely talking with West Virginia and watching how this goes. I think it did seem that the first run of it was successful, but I think, like we all know, there's a lot of risks with using untested technology. So I think that's going to be something to watch over time. In the meantime, we are, we are effectuating an encrypted email process that's going to be used for the first time. I'm sorry, I lost my voice, but that's going to be used, that's going to allow, instead of having to access a website, encrypted emails for delivery of the ballot to the voters, and that's kind of our next technology way to protect the vote overseas, of overseas voters. Sorry.
Mr. Burt, your technology seems to, Election Guard seems to utilize both ends of the spectrum there. You're having a paper ballot backup, but exploring open source solutions. Do you still, are you researching efforts to replace paper ballots, design and create additional software efforts that could replace paper ballots, or are you of the mind that you should always have that paper ballot backup?
So our view is that whether paper ballot is the backup or primary, either way, the Election Guard technology can help provide this level of security and end-to-end verifiability. We've designed it so that it will work with paper ballots in either way. But our position is that today, it's important to have a verified paper ballot backup at a minimum to use for risk-limiting audits and have it available in the worst case so that you can do a hand count if necessary. So we think, and our technology supports that as well. So we think it's important. If I just may comment quickly on blockchain, our researchers who look really carefully at election-based technology do not think blockchain is a great solution for a nationwide election. We're very interested in the West Virginia experiment. We'll continue to look at that, but it has a very specific focus which it may be useful for. For the most part, there are two big problems with blockchain. It's a distributed ledger, and you really need to have a leader, which we have leaders now with state and local election officials who establish what the rules are for voting and for who's on the ballot and who's not. So there's challenges with blockchain technology inherently, and furthermore, on a nationwide level, it would not maintain the degree of security and privacy in each individual's vote that is critical to our national elections.
You've been working globally on this effort. Have you seen in other countries any evidence that of hackers and whether your work in other countries on those issues has led directly to denying hackers an option to penetrate election infrastructure?
So the work that we've done globally so far has been with our Account Guard service, where we monitor nation-state actors attempting to hack into the accounts of candidates or others involved in the election process, including third parties, academics, and NGOs. And what we have seen is that there are attacks in many other countries. We saw it in a number of the ones that Chairman Nadler referenced in his opening statement. We saw it as well in the French presidential election following ours in 2016. So this pattern of conduct by the Russians, but potentially by other nation states, is absolutely continuing in multiple different countries.
Thank the witnesses.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chair, thank you. In 2016, Vladimir Putin assessed the Russian posture vis-a-vis other countries. He realized he could not defeat liberal democracies militarily or economically, but he convened the equivalent of a Manhattan Project for electronic subversion of the cyber elections and the social media of democratic countries. And so from prior hearings, I've learned it was a three-pronged attack. Part of it was on the social media. There was an effort to inject racial propaganda and other kinds of ideological poison into Facebook and Twitter and so on. 2, there was a direct effort to hack into the DNC, the DCCC, Hillary Clinton's emails. We're aware of that and have had testimony about that. And the third part was to go right to the state boards of elections to try to get into those systems. And I want to ask a couple questions about that. I understand that they made their most progress in terms of the Illinois system, actually got into the voter registration database, although they were not able, apparently they tried, but they were not able to nullify the existence of voters on the database. What might have happened had they been able to do that? And how secure are we against that in a similar attack in 2020, Ms. Bookvar?
So the way it's been described to me is what they did was kind of like, if you're a thief and you go around a neighborhood and you try to figure out which houses have unlocked doors or windows, which are the easiest to break into, and when they're locked, you move on to the next one. So they scanned a bunch of states, found most of the doors and windows locked, and moved on to the next. And I think that that's why we were successful at not having a worse situation. It could have been, as has been discussed previously, it could have been devastating.
Remember the National Association of Secretaries of State?
Correct.
How secure are the states? How ready are we? People ask me all the time, how ready are we? But we don't have one system. We have at least 50 systems, right? Or 51 systems all over the country.
I think we are absolutely in a much better place than we were 2 years ago, and I think the designation of elections as critical infrastructure was a big start to that. I think we still have a ways to go, and that's why I'm really interested, Congressman, on making sure that we don't focus entirely on voting systems. Voting systems are really important, but we need to be funding replacement of voter registration systems, intrusion detection systems, making sure that the counties have the cyber protections, the passwords, the multi-factor authentication. Those are just as important as the voting systems, and we need to recognize that.
Ms. Plunkett, would we be safer in protecting our presidential elections, which are obviously the biggest magnet and target for foreign actors? Would we be better off if we had one national popular vote and electoral system for president, or are we better off using the current electoral college system where we have a state-by-state voting and we've got to protect all those different systems?
What's most important is that we have the right whichever system we would choose to use, what's most important is that we have the right security protections in place. And with the right security protections in place, either would work equally effectively, I believe.
Okay. Mr. Byrd, I was very cheered to hear your testimony. Are you telling us that we essentially have a technological fix to the problem of security of the actual voting systems themselves?
Yes, Congressman, we think the election guard technology, once it's implemented in devices and those devices have been adopted, will provide a high degree of security, and more importantly, will provide this end-to-end verifiability, which will enable individual voters and voting officials to be able to trust the outcome, with the ability to have audits as a backup to add a layer of verifiability and trust in the system.
And it will promote a lot more confidence in the reliability of the results.
Yes, ultimately it would provide a much greater degree of confidence in the outcome, in part because individual voters, for the first time, will see that their vote actually was counted.
Yeah, I mean, all of you have emphasized that our electoral integrity is a matter of national security. And if you think about it, well, why does Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Orban in Hungary and Duterte and all the authoritarians and despots and dictators want to destabilize our elections? It's because they want to destroy people's faith and confidence in democracy. They would like everything to be about authoritarian despots who just make deals around the world and go and corrupt each other's elections and interfere in each other's governments. I yield back. Thank you for your testimony.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burt, thanks for coming in today, and thanks for all you're doing to make our elections safe and protecting democracy. I just wanted to see if you'd like to speak about why Microsoft got into the election space, and just generally speak, say if there's anything where you want to elaborate on Election Guard.
Absolutely. And this goes to a number of the questions about how we got to where we're at today. We need to keep in mind that our foreign adversaries' direct efforts to intervene in our elections is a relatively new phenomenon, and the process for certifying devices and so forth is an older phenomenon. So this is something that the entire election community is reacting to in a relatively short period of time. For Microsoft, this started in 2016 during the Democratic National Convention, when our security team saw that a group that we call Strontium, which we now know from the Mueller indictment is a Russian organization operated by the GRU, the same group, when we saw that organization registering a bunch of fake Microsoft domains, domain names, websites that looked like they were Microsoft but really were not. And because of the timing, we immediately took action and ultimately actually went to court. And we've been in a battle with that same organization now over several years in court, where every time they register fake domains or use them to try to steal credentials, we go to court, get an order, we take those down and direct all of that traffic to our own sinkhole at our digital crimes unit. So we're in a constant technological battle with that organization. It started then. And then as we fast forward over the next year, I had a conversation with our president, my boss, Brad Smith, and we talked about the obligation we have as a company based in a democracy, founded in a democracy, to help protect, however we can, those democratic institutions and our voting process as a core democratic institution. And that's when we founded our Defending Democracy program, which we're going to continue to invest in and advance in coming years.
Thank you again, Mr. Byrd. I really appreciate all you're doing. And with that, I would yield the remainder of my time to my friend and colleague from Florida.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I initially have a unanimous consent request that H.R. 3529, the bipartisan election security legislation I referenced earlier, be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I want to return to this issue of paper ballots versus blockchain technology. And I know that we all likely have a lot to learn on that. Mr. Burt, do you view blockchain technology as potentially being more applicable to the voter rolls and the maintenance of the rolls and ensuring that there's no manipulation of those than to the actual vote itself? Or would you view the technology as applicable or inapplicable to those two silos of election data separately?
So I think you do need to evaluate those two things separately because they really are different problem sets, right? So you need to look at the problem set and what you're trying to address. And there's two different problem sets between voting, where we don't think blockchain is a great solution for a nationwide election, and the voter registration rolls, where, to be honest, it's something I need to go back and talk to our experts about whether it's a potential solution. Offhand, I'm not sure that it is because, again, you don't really want, in the context even of a voter registration roll, you don't want a distributed ledger. You want a ledger with a leader.
Why is that?
Because you want to have someone who has the decision-making authority about what's a legitimate registration and what's not. And in a distributed environment, that's being determined by every other participant in that environment. Now, there may be a way to make blockchain applicable to the voter registration process to help with this security issue. I want to go back and talk to our experts, but offhand, I think it's probably not the right technological fit.
So, yeah, and my question, and again, I'm not asserting that it is, it's just very interesting to me that it seems to be less susceptible to manipulation because in the event that you had the circumstance you described where someone was attempting to manipulate the data, instead of us relying on one supervisor of elections, a Department of State, or even some of these joint task forces that I think we've very productively discussed today, you would have potentially thousands of different nodes and capabilities to be able to diagnose that manipulation. My concern now is if you can essentially flummox a supervisor of elections, you can manipulate the voter rolls. And as I sit here today, having received the briefing that I know my Florida colleagues received, I'm not certain that in my state there wasn't some manipulation of the voter rolls, and no one's been able to reflect that certainty to me. And so I'm just trying to kind of democratize the oversight of that system potentially. And so again, I don't expect anyone to be an expert on this. I think we've got a lot to learn about it. But I just reject the premise that only a piece of paper gives us a sense of a lack of manipulation.
I don't disagree with that, Congressman. And if I may, I'd like to go back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me go back and we come back to you and answer the question more specifically about blockchain and voter registration rolls, whether that or some other approach is the best means of securing those rolls.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. I am from Florida, and I represent Florida, and I do agree with my colleague's earlier statement from Florida that every voter, regardless of their party, where they live, their zip code, deserves to have their vote counted. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for this very timely and important hearing. Mr. Burke, I'd just like to ask you, have you faced any obstacles at the federal level with implementing Election Guard? And if so, what have they been?
We have not faced any obstacles at the federal level to implement Election Guard. Now that the technology is actually out and available for inspection and deployment, we expect to have continued conversations with a number of representatives, federal government, where we will explain the technology and how it works. But I don't anticipate actually any federal level resistance, because I think we are aligned with the federal interests, especially those of CISA and others responsible for our election security.
And if you could state again, what's the timeline of implementation?
So the technology is available right now for implementation in devices. The timeline is complex, and that is a bit of a problem. It's complex for a number of reasons, some that really government can't do much about because the vendors have to inspect the technology, determine whether they want to put it in devices. There has to be demand from state and local vendors for the technology, which we think there will be based on our conversations so far. But then once those are available, there has to be the funding at the state and local level to be able to deploy the new devices that implement the technology. And all of that is subject to this currently outdated certification process that takes too long, it's too burdensome, and it's too hard. And those rules are being updated right now by the Election Assistance Commission, but we need to make sure that they're updated in a way that provides much more agility and flexibility. So you've got all of those pieces that need to come into alignment. We're confident they will. We're confident we'll have some pilot elections utilizing this technology no later than 2020, but the sooner that it can be deployed in order to see our elections, the better.
My understanding is that certain of the breaches in the 2016 election, when they were going door to door looking to see which windows are unlocked and doors, were not immediately detected. So my question is, what signs should election officials be trained to look for on election day to ensure that there are no undetected attacks, either of?
The first and most important is to have a baseline of what normal looks like. And every election jurisdiction needs to know what normal operations looks like so that they can then have the appropriate monitoring in place should there be any abnormal activity, whether that be a flow of data that looks unusual, a disruption of data that looks unusual, a login from an unusual, someone who should not have access, from an account that should not have access. So knowing what normal and having that baseline and then being able to monitor for any abnormal activity is the most important.
And I would say every level needs to be trained in this. So, but starting from technology, right? The intrusion detection systems should be in every single county in the country and every municipality that runs elections. I think that's one of the most critical components for protecting our elections from here forward. And I'd love to see resources from the federal government to make sure that that happens so that we don't have voters in under-resourced counties with less security than others. But then poll workers, and my first job in elections was as a poll worker, and making sure that we have the support and training for the poll workers to be able to recognize not only signs that are problematic, like people not being in the voting rolls, but knowing about provisional ballots. We haven't mentioned provisional ballots yet once in this hearing. We actually have a provision that allows when people are not in the voter rolls to still vote. But sometimes poll workers don't remember to do that or don't know to do that. So they need to be adequately trained. Every voter can get a provisional ballot, and then it can be checked later. So if that person's eligible, they should never, ever be turned away.
Thank you so much. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. There are 4 minutes and 20 seconds left on a vote on the floor. We have a number of votes on the floor. The committee will stand in recess, but will reconvene immediately upon cessation of the votes on the floor. So please, I ask the members of the committee, come back as soon as the last vote is cast. The committee stands in recess. gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the patience of our witnesses as they waited for us while we registered our votes. And that's what we're focusing on, aren't we? Voting. So thank you for being here. Election security is all about voter confidence and participation. The more confident voters are in the integrity of election systems, the more confident they will feel that their vote has been counted and that their voice has been heard, and of course, this directly impacts their future participation. I listened with great interest to some of your testimony, and I've looked at your written testimony, and I wanted to start with you, Mr. Burt. And quickly, I don't need I heard you explain the system that you have, and I just want to make sure that anyone watching is clear. Is yours a software system or a software system and machines and an auditing system too, or all of the above, one of the above?
Ours is a software system that needs to be incorporated into the voting system that is utilized by the state or local voting officials. And it supports multiple different forms of voting systems. So you can have an electronic ballot marking device. You can start with hand-marked ballots that are then scanned. We support those, and we're working to support others that are not as widely used. But it's basically software that needs to be incorporated by vendors into the voting system itself.
And the verification that the user the voter can go to online, that will simply just verify that they voted, or can they print something at home through your software system?
So the system, when they vote, when they go to the polling place and they vote, they get a piece of paper that has the code. They can then enter the code in later, and they will get verification that their vote was counted. They can't see their vote. This is really critically important. They can't see who they voted for. They know who they voted for, but what the system tells them is your vote was not changed and your vote was counted. And it's important that they not be able to see their vote, because otherwise they could be coerced into voting in a certain way. You could sell your vote. This is an important characteristic.
Anyone doing an audit would also not be able to see how they voted.
That's correct. And that's actually
there really is no paper trail.
There is a paper trail in the sense that our system supports the creation of a verified paper ballot. So you vote, that's encrypted, but you also get a paper ballot that the voter can look at and say, yes, this is correct. You deposit that in the ballot box. That can be used for risk-limiting audits, even for hand counts if necessary, although it shouldn't be necessary.
Well, I'm thinking of a lot of people in my district that don't have a computer at home, don't have a laptop, don't have a way of doing any of that. So what are we to do with, quite frankly, the usual targeted populations when there is some of this misinformation, hacking? It's usually many times minority voter precincts that get attacked. So what would we do then for the person who doesn't have access to a computer or internet to be able to go through that process?
So our system is based on polling place voting, whether it's hand-marked ballots or using an electronic voting machine. The election guard supports going to the polling place to vote. So you don't need to have any technology in order to vote.
No, but to verify.
But to verify, and yes, and so.
Talking specifically about verifying that you voted.
Correct.
It's actually sort of happened to me once. I voted, and I thought I had done everything, and then they came into the car to get me and said, I was a senator at the time. They said, Senator, it didn't go through. And I said, what do you mean it didn't go through? So I had to go back in and essentially vote again. Yes. It made no sense to me that I had to do that, and I think that happens probably more often than not. So I'm just concerned about the populations who don't have access to that computer to verify that, in fact, their vote was counted.
Totally understandable. The good news is that you can do the verification in our system with a smartphone. And in most populations, smartphones have penetrated much further than laptops.
Well, many in my district do not have smartphones. They just have the one that you go to the flea market or a store, and what are they called? The click-it phones or flip phones? They don't have the smartphone. Those are more costly. They go in there, the cricket phones. They go there and get 1 month at a time. We're talking about people that are paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford one like mine.
Yes, and I understand, Congresswoman, and the verification does require some access to a system, whether it's your neighbor's phone, your phone, go to the library and access a computer to get that personal verification. Now keep in mind, that's a new advance of the technology, but to do that verification and see that your vote was counted with our system, you will need access to something, whether it's a smartphone, a public computer, some device that lets you see, yes, my vote in fact got counted.
Well, thank you. I've run out of time, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bookvar, I wanted to thank you for your work in removing barriers to voting in Pennsylvania for everyone who's eligible to vote. In particular, I wanted to thank you for your attention to modernization of Pennsylvania's voting system and things such as just 2 weeks ago, rolling out the ability to request absentee ballots online. I know my 3 children who do not live in the district anymore when they're at school appreciate that ability. You've also paid a lot of attention to our young voters, and I know particularly high school registration. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you've done there?
Governor Wolf started a couple of years ago the Governor's Civic Engagement Award, and it's been a tremendous success in Pennsylvania, encouraging students in schools to register eligible voters to vote. And it's been a terrific, both the competition from school to school and from student to student, but also their engagement in voting, which, as we all know, probably a lot of us started our civic engagement early, and it really, research shows when you are engaged early, you probably become lifelong voters, and that's critical to our democracy.
Okay. Turning more to what's at hand here, there's been discussion about needing to improve lines of communication between federal, state, and local agencies. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot as we develop these conversations around election security is the importance of continuity of operations, or coup planning. And it's one of those things that I think a lot of areas like emergency management and law enforcement have been doing for a long time, but the election sphere, it's relatively new. And one of the critical components of effective coup planning is to know who to call at the moment you need to call them. Because the last thing you want to do when an incident happens is figure out who the right person is to call. So the more clarity we have about who at the federal government is the call to make at incident X, Y, or Z, the better it would be for the counties to not to have to figure it out at the moment. And we're doing a lot of work with the counties to develop those coup plans, but we need that to come from the federal government as well to make sure we have centralized lines of contact.
If you have one piece of advice for Congress as we debate the appropriate vehicles to legislate and to fund this, what would that be?
I think I'd have to go back to our conversation about diversifying the types of election security that's implemented across the country. So there's been a lot of attention to voting systems, which is a very important thing to transition to paper records. But as we discussed earlier, so many other components of this process are at least as critical. So we need to allow funding to go to voter registration databases, intrusion detection systems, making sure that we have layered defenses to all our networks, phishing and security training and multi-factor authentication and coup planning. All those things are equally important, and I'm most worried about thinking that one solution is going to fix everything. We need to give the states the ability to decide what their most critical components are.
And as I understand it, that involves both work in helping establish best practices that the federal government can help push out, and then providing funding to achieve those best practices?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Chairman, for hosting this important hearing today. It's one of the most pressing issues facing our nation. Thank you to the witnesses for not only appearing today and sharing your expertise, but for taking such a leading role in protecting the integrity and security of our elections at all levels of government. It's much appreciated. Our nation came under attack in 2016. The special counsel described Russia's efforts to interfere in our elections as, quote, sweeping and systemic, unquote. They deceived Americans, hacked into campaign email accounts, hacked into the very systems and databases that conduct our elections at the state level. We know that these same kind of attacks continue to this very day. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, Director Christopher Wray, stated that, quote, this is not just an election cycle threat, it's pretty much a 365-day-a-year threat, unquote. And despite that, this White House has done nothing. It joins the Senate in sitting on its hands in the fight to defend our democracy. It's a real travesty, and I hope that this hearing and legislative efforts, we can begin to turn the tide. Unfortunately, my home state of Arizona, its voter registration database was one of Russia's targets. Their attack wasn't successful, but it shows the heightened importance local officials must place on election security. Ms. Plunkett, you mentioned in your written testimony the importance of the integrity of voter registration databases and e-poll books. When it comes to the use of e-poll books for voter registration rosters and ballot-on-demand printers, do you agree that it is a best practice to use encrypted communications in all circumstances when data is transmitted or received?
Yes, I do.
Can you think of a circumstance, is there ever a circumstance where election officials should transmit or receive data on these devices in a non-encrypted manner?
I cannot envision a circumstance such as that.
Thank you. Ms. Plunkett, you also mentioned that the steps the federal government and state governments must take will cost more than $2 billion. Not all states are adequately investing in election security. Some, including Arizona, are cutting election security funds. What type of outcomes and risks are states that don't take this issue seriously exposing themselves to?
Well, they're exposing themselves to the potential for their election outcomes to be corrupted, invalid, not accepted, not trusted by the populace that they represent, and ultimately the impact of the perception could be much worse than the reality, which would mean people would not come out to vote.
Thank you for that answer. And this is a question for all of the witnesses. Some elected officials use USB devices to transfer data from one device to another. Is it best practice to use those devices only a single time to minimize the possibility of malware, or to use those devices repeatedly?
I would go with yes, that it is certainly a best practice. There are some circumstances where, as long as there's effective reformatting, that might be effective, but I think using new ones is always, I would say, the best practice.
Mr. Burt?
I would caution that USB devices are a known vector for the transmission of malware, which can be installed at the time of their manufacture. So even using new USB devices from anything other than a very highly trusted source, and increasingly that would mean of American manufacture if you're using it in an election in the United States, is a challenging thing to do. You can try to scan that device, you can try to make sure it doesn't have malware on it before it's ever used, but that could be a very costly and time-consuming practice. So the use of USB devices is something that we would say you should be very cautious about doing it even once, because the malware may be present on that device when you first use it.
Thank you. Ms. Plunkett, have your thoughts on that subject matter?
I would go so far as to say that unless there are no other alternatives, the use of thumb drive should be prohibited.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing. I want to associate myself so as not to be repetitious with Representative Stanton's remarks of the gravity of the situation, as well as the chairman. Secretary Bookvar, as you said, and you're not alone in saying this, nothing is more important than the security of our elections. Nothing in this democracy is more important than that. And so I'm glad we're talking about these issues. And Secretary Bookvar, of course, I'm delighted to see you here from Pennsylvania. I thank you and Governor Wolf for your service, particularly in the area of election security. I'm thinking back to Mueller coming in and telling us and telling the world that certainly our elections were interfered with in 2016, and if I recall him correctly, he said and it's going on 24/7. That interference continues. Can you describe some of our vulnerabilities as of 2016 and maybe lay out some of the vulnerabilities that you still see?
So I think the good news, and going back to what we talked about earlier, is the good that arose from what happened in the past is that we are, with the declaration of being critical infrastructure, it's provided us with a lot more resources. And so, one of the things that I really, think is critically important across the country as well as in the state are these collaborations that we've been talking about. So I think the lack of collaboration and intersection of resources could be a vulnerability if it's ignored. And so, for example, we found in Pennsylvania, as we started to have like tabletop exercises and really improve our collaborations, a lot of times in the counties, the election officials didn't even know the emergency management personnel. And that's crazy, right? So in 2018, the primary was almost like a real-life tabletop exercise. I don't know if you recall, but there was a tornado that crossed the state literally on primary day. And so we had to have, trees were down, polling places were blocked, electricity went out. The intersection of the emergency management, law enforcement, and elections was critical, is critical. So I think one of the vulnerabilities is not feeding that well. And it's, again, it goes back to the coup planning too. But then I also want to make sure that our counties have the resources they need to have really advanced intrusion detection systems, effective training of phishing and security and all that, and every advanced sensor and protection, layered defenses of their network. So those are the areas that I would really focus on. Supporting the local counties and municipalities would be one of the areas I'd want to direct most attention.
And the issue of certification, I guess, of the equipment itself, what is the delay there? How could we streamline that? Either you or any of the witnesses.
The issue there is that the standards that are the guidelines that are promulgated by the Election Assistance Commission are more than 10 years old. In fact, the most recent modification to those guidelines, there's not a single election system that's ever been certified under those most recent guidelines, and they're 10 years old. So what the Election Assistance Commission is doing right now, which is revising those guidelines, is critically important, but they need to move quickly. They need to move with expeditious activity because this threat, as you pointed out, Congresswoman, is 24/7. It's happening now. It's going to happen through the 2020 election cycle. So we need the EAC to adopt new guidelines for certification quickly. The current ones don't adequately address security, and they take too long and they're too burdensome. So we need to streamline that process, make it faster. And one of the really critical things for all state and local election officials is we need to make it very easy to apply security updates. That's a key defense to these adversaries from every vendor. And so we need to be able to apply security updates quickly, expeditiously, without so much bureaucracy so that we can respond.
Thank you very much. And this will just be by way of sort of a rhetorical statement. And I was struck by something you wrote in your testimony, Secretary Bookvar. You wrote that election security is a race without a finish line, that our adversaries are continuously advancing their technologies, and we must do more all the time. So we know that we can't see a finish line for this, and we have to identify the threats. I have to wonder what conversations all of you have had to have with your own organizations based on foreign threats, but now the news of this past week, domestic threat to our election. It couldn't be a more grave time. None of us is pleased with the news of the Ukraine conversation by the President of the United States and an attempt to interfere in a future election. So I praise you all for your work. Help us do better at our work to protect our elections, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. This concludes today's hearing. We thank all of our witnesses for participating. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And with that, without objection, the hearing is adjourned.